Management Studio is far more limited than Report Manager for report server management, but nonetheless supports some very important tasks. There are really three primary kinds of things that you can do with Management Studio for reporting services. The first is that this is a primary way of enabling and disabling features, as well as set some server defaults. You can also manage running jobs, security, and shared schedules. So depending on how you're using reporting services, you may need to go into Management Studio in order to work with those particular kinds of objects. And then you can also view administrative reports about the health of the server. And this is the typical part of Management Studio. Just about every object that you look at using Management Studio, whether you're connected to reporting services, the database engine, analysis services, or whatever, there are various standard reports that you can look at that give you information about what's going on within the server. And then you can also create your own custom reports. That's a whole different kind of report within SQL Server and not something that I cover in this course. All right, so I'm not going to cover every feature of Management Studio support for reporting services, but I am going to explore the interface and look at a few of the more common things that you can do with the tool. All right, here I am in my Windows development machine, so I'll start up Management Studio, something I use so often that I just have a toolbar button down there. And then as usual, I get this Connect to Server dialog box. Now it's really important to connect correctly when starting up Management Studio when you're going to use it with reporting services. Instead of connecting to the database engine, as you might be used to doing often, maybe even every day, be sure to select reporting services here. So database engine is the default, it's the first thing on the list. As you can see, you can also connect to analysis services, reporting services, and integration services. But in this case, I want reporting services. And then of course you need to provide whatever credentials in order to connect to the server. I'm a local admin on this machine, and so I'm going to use Windows Authentication because I'm authorized as a system admin to access reporting services this way. But you may need to connect using basic authentication or forms authentication. Okay, but certainly Windows Authentication is the easiest way to go. And one nice thing about this selection right here is sticky. Well, in fact, all of the selections are sticky. So the next time I start up Management Studio after connecting to reporting services, these are the options that are going to be displayed for me. But I can have a list of servers that I connect to regularly and so forth. I can also select this and type in a server name. And again, I'm using localhost here, but I can type in the machine name or whatever I need to do, even IP address, in order to connect to the server on some remote network someplace. All right, there are also some options down here that you can use. So if you need to change the connection timeout, so it's by default is 100,000 seconds, or you can change that to a longer or shorter amount. And then you can also opt to always use SSL. Definitely something advisable. Probably less, well, I was going to say less useful with Windows Integrated Authentication, but only from the perspective that I'm not passing my Windows login credentials to the server. So they don't really need to be protected with SSL. But if I were to change to forms or basic authentication, then I would definitely want to do my best to set this up for SSL, because then the connection between management server here on my local machine, if I'm connecting to a remote machine, is then all the traffic between Management Studio and the server is then encrypted and protected. Okay, and then there's some additional connection parameters if you want to include any custom parameters and so forth. I don't need to do anything else special, so I'll go ahead and click on Connect, and it'll take a few moments and connect to the default local instance on my machine of reporting services. All right, so once you've connected, you'll find that Object Explorer is open and gives you access to the objects defined in this instance of the server, reporting services instance. Okay, so now you can explore different parts of this. You can explore the different jobs that might be running. I just started up this machine, so I don't have any jobs running. You can look at security, look at shared schedules, and so forth. Now, one thing to point out here. If you ever come in and right-click on something and there are any items that are disabled, well, it means that you don't have access to that particular feature. So this is kind of strange. properties is disabled, which means that I, as I'm currently logged in, can't access the properties of the report server. Yet that's what I want to show you. That has a lot of features that you need to work with. In fact, it has most of what I'm going to be showing you. Okay, so what the problem is here is that even though I connected to the reporting services instance as myself, who has local system admin privileges both on the local version of Windows as well as within the server, with this particular security environment, I have to run Management Studio as an administrator. So I'm going to go ahead and shut this down, come back over here, real easy thing to rectify. I'm just right-clicking twice, and I'm going to run this as an administrator. I get the UAC dialog box, click on Yes, and Management Studio starts up. I'm going to once again connect using those same credentials. Everything looks the same so far, other than I have administrator in the title there. But now when I right-click on this, I have access to everything. Okay, so just keep that in mind. If there's anything that you're not getting access to that you think you should be, that might be the problem. All right, now one thing to point out immediately about what you see here is that there's no node within Object Explorer that says anything about reports or data sources or data sets or other items that make up the reports that you build and access using reporting services. That's because you can't use Management Studio or Object Explorer in order to access or manage reports or other content on the report server. For that, you need to use Report Manager. So that's what I want to show you, what features are available in Management Studio. And then separately, you can access the content using Report Manager. Okay, so let's start looking at what you can do with Management Studio. One of the probably the most important things is to set report server properties. So this lets you enable features and set server defaults. So this is the kind of thing that you're probably going to come in here after you've installed reporting services, after you've run Configuration Manager to get the overall things working within it. You're probably going to want to come into Management Studio and then tweak a few more settings. All right, to get access to that, you just right-click here, select Properties, and that opens up this Server Properties dialog box. All right, so the first page that you get here is the General page. This only has a few settings, but does display some information about the reporting services instance. So I can't change any of these. These are all disabled, so if I try and type over that, can't do anything. So these are just information only. But it's nice because I can see what version of reporting services I'm currently connected to. This is version 12, which in numeric version speak equates to the version of reporting services that ships with SQL Server 2014. I have the developer edition of SQL Server installed. I'm connected using Windows Authentication, and then this is the URL to the report server. Okay, I can't change any of those here. I can change this if I want to by using Configuration Manager, not Management Studio. All right, then we come to a few options that you can set on this page. The first thing is that you can enable a My Reports folder for each user. This is disabled or unchecked by default. So previously I had gone in here, enabled the My Reports, so that each user that is authorized to access the reporting services report server using Report Manager has a My Reports folder and then can put linked reports in there. If they build their own reports using Report Builder or Visual Studio, they can put those reports there as well, even if they don't have access to update the content in other parts of the report server. Okay, so I have to come in here and enable that explicitly before users have that option. And then, as part of enabling that, I can select the role to apply. My Reports is a built-in role. It's installed by default with reporting services when you install it. But this is the role that all users who need to get access to My Reports, their My Reports folder, then they need to have this permission. And by default, all regular users of the report server do have it, but you can revoke that if you want to. All right, and then the last item is to be able to enable download for the ActiveX client print control. And so what this does is that if you want your users to be able to print reports directly from Report Manager, again, not Management Studio, but Report Manager, then you need to enable this. And that way, the first time they try to print a report from a report server, they'll click the print button within Report Manager, and they'll be asked permission to install this ActiveX control. Right. So it's nice that Microsoft protects us against ActiveX controls, but this is a relatively safe one. It is coming from Microsoft, and so it's, well, you may have your own opinions about ActiveX controls, but if you want to allow your users to directly print reports, then you need to enable this. Okay, and then the one other thing that you can change here is that you can, in fact, change the name of this instance of Report Manager. Okay, frankly, you can change this to whatever you want. So I can say Wahoo. And as near as I can tell, that really doesn't change it anywhere that's visible. But I suppose it's good that you can change the name. As near as I can tell, it just doesn't change it anywhere else. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of that. I'll leave it to Microsoft's default, even though they kindly let me edit it. So, all right. And then next I want to take a look at the execution page. And there's just a single option here. 2 radio buttons that you can flip on or off between the 2 options. It's a performance-related setting. It lets you set a time limit on report execution. So by default, it's selected to limit report execution to the following number of seconds, 1800 seconds, or 30 minutes. Or you can alternatively set the first option and do not time out report execution. Now, it's important to understand that this setting applies to all reports rendered on this instance of reporting services. So this becomes the new default setting. But you can override the value for an individual report if it has unusually high processing limits, or it just takes a long time to extract the data, render it, and so forth. Now, the time that you set here has to allow for all report processing as well as query processing in the database engine when the report retrieves its data. All right, so my best advice for you is to never turn off the report execution timeout, because if you do, a rogue report could execute for a very long time, potentially hogging most of the report server's processing capabilities and resources. Okay, not a good thing. If you have a report that takes longer than 30 minutes to completely render, including data access, maybe you need to enforce parameter values that make the report smaller. I realize that I really can't make absolutes about this, but moral of the story is be very careful about turning off the timeout for report execution. Next, let's look at the history page. This continues the trend of 1 setting per page in the Properties dialog box. A little bit weird just how much space there is available within this dialog box. Okay, so what this does is it lets you specify whether you want to keep an unlimited number of snapshots in report history or limit the copies to some predetermined number that you set. So again, this is a setting that you set as the default for this instance of reporting services, but you can change it for individual reports. So if you have a sensitive report, you want to keep tabs on the data, on just the history of when that report is run, then you can access that data. And again, by default, it's an unlimited number. But if you want to limit it, maybe you're running out of disk space or just for performance purposes or whatever, you can limit the number of copies. Now, what's the report history? Well, it's a collection of snapshots that include both data and layout when a report is rendered. It's a history of the report that you can access for any specific date or time. And these history items are stored in the report server database. Now, one downside to the default unlimited setting is that it means that the database could become overly large over time, particularly if you have a lot of large reports that are being run often by a lot of different users. You could end up using a lot of space. So you may want to monitor that as you do all of the databases. All right, now let's look at logging, another underused bit of space within the dialog box. This lets you set limits on the execution data collected on the report server, which is also stored in the report server database. This first setting lets you enable or disable report execution logging, and then the second will automatically clean out the log of all entries older than the number of days that you specify, which, as you can see, is 60 by default. And both of these options are enabled by default. So logging's good generally, it does take up disk space, but it can give you a lot of information in case any problems occur with the report server. All right, next up is the security page. This lets you enable a couple of security settings for the report server. Now, a bit surprisingly, the first option here is enabled by default. This does slightly increase the risk of a compromise of the report server. All right, so this is the Enable Windows Integrated Security for report data sources. So this option, and again, it's turned on by default, lets you use that authentication option for data sources used by reports to access data. So when it's enabled, a data source using this option will connect to the database using the report user's Windows credentials. If you turn this setting off, uncheck the box, the Windows Integrated Security feature in the property pages for all data sources will be unavailable. So this is actually going to change the data sources that you have deployed to this report services instance. If there are any data sources that use this authentication when you disable it, the report server immediately updates them all to prompt users for credentials. So be very careful doing that. All right, and then this other option is enable ad hoc report executions. So it's disabled on my machine here, but it's off by default, and it specifies whether users can create ad hoc queries from a report builder report. Enabling the option potentially exposes the report server to a denial of service attack by overloading the server with load report definition method requests, which is the underlying method for working with ad hoc report definitions. So just be aware of that. So that's the one that I mentioned. If you turn on, potentially could cause you some problems. So you only turn it on if you need to. All right, then the last page in the Properties dialog box is Advanced. So this one makes up for all of the largely empty pages for the other pages in this dialog box, the other tabs. So the Advanced page has a wealth of options and settings for the report server. Now surprisingly, pretty much all of the options on the other pages are also settable here. So if you just want a one-stop place to go for all of the settings, the properties of this report server instance that you can change within Management Studio, you might want to just come here and just get used to using it. All right, so there's all kinds of things. You see there's the Enable My Reports. It's set to true because that was set in the other page that I showed you earlier. My Reports role is My Reports, and so you can explore all of these. And then if you need help for any of these, you can also click the Help button, and this will load up a browser with the Help page for this dialog box, and you can get descriptions of all the different options that are available here.